Welcome to the Planner Pals podcast, hosted by your two true Planner Pals. I am Jess or Jashi Corinne.
And my name is Mark from Mark Your Pages. And Jess, we are going to have an episode today. We're following up on our last episode, which was why bullet journaling, right? And we talked about how we found out about bullet journaling and got into it. And at the end of the episode, we asked the audience, what's the biggest myth that you've heard about bullet journaling? And what we're going to do today is first focus on that. We're going to talk about those responses and thank everyone for responding. It's so awesome to get those from the community. But today's episode, we're going to talk about, can you bullet journal wrong? Do you have any specific thoughts before we go into the feedback from the question on this topic? Because I feel like I'm going to get in trouble this episode.
Yeah, possibly tentative kind of like easing into this territory. And I know people get very passionate about what is a bullet journal and what is not a bullet journal, but I do think that there is technically a way to bullet journal wrong. I think if we flip it around, I don't necessarily think there's a right way, but a wrong way, yes, I do think there is.
All right, so excited for that. I know we have some pieces. Also, I have to let you know, I have used Persnickety Biscuit way more than I ever have. Literally last episode, that word is just stuck in my brain now. So I've been saying it all the time. I said it to my wife the other day. She was like, what? What did you? I was like, sorry, Jess says it. No, I say it.
Yeah. I love the way that we like build kind of other people's talk and speak pieces into our own lexicon. I do that very frequently.
Oh my goodness. All right, well, let's get into some of these myths. So I think last time we talked about some of our top myths, which really that it takes a really long time to do, that you have to be creative, and what I really got out of the last episode too was, why do we have to break apart creativity and functionality and productivity in together? So here's what we heard from the community on this one. Here's some of the top ones that we heard. So the first one came from Sammy, and their biggest myth, they said, was that only creative people could use a bullet journal. And I think that we did talk about that, right? That bullet journaling, what it is and how people use it, can sometimes be two very different things. I think that'll probably be a big part of this episode, is that it doesn't have to be creative, but let's not hold back if you want to be creative.
I think it's that kind of matter of like the way that it's perceived in like, the general community outside of the people who already bullet journal. And when you're seeing a lot of this stuff on social media that is really decorative, really artistic, it can kind of put people off a little bit, which is always a shame, because if we go back to the original method, it is not, no offense, writer, it's not that pretty.
Well, it's not. It's really supposed to just be writing down the things, right? I think we probably, as a community and people who took up the DIY part of this, because you really are kind of creating your own journal from it, started to add those pieces to it. That actually was a perfect way to lead into this next one. So Paper, Pens, and Coffee said that the biggest myth that they have heard about bullet journaling is that you have to follow what the inventor of the system said or not do it at all. There are people out there, I mean, I call them the bullet journal purists. They 100 believe that it's the good word of writer or nothing. Have you come across that? I'm sure you have.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Especially in my bullet journal basics series, which was kind of funny because I specifically modeled that series to be within the bullet journal method, like as it was originally pitched. And I still had people coming out of the woodwork like, it's not a bullet journal unless, or you didn't put enough, I don't know, black ink on the paper. I don't even know what. They get very precise about how they want you to follow things.
It's so interesting. I mean, I guess it's like anything in the world. You could probably just say the same thing about religion, right? You have people who follow it literally by the book, word for word, and they think you cannot kind of break apart from that. You have people who like want to interpret it how they want to. I think whatever best fits your life. I personally feel like that is the way to go. I've always felt that way about both bullet journaling, religion, anything else. Like, you have to do what feels right for you to help you get through your day. And if you feel differently about it, it's okay to have a difference of opinion, but like, we don't need to burn somebody, at the stake because they added a sticker to their weekly, right?
I love that border between like minimalist planning versus not. And it's like, oh no, sorry, you used a highlighter, you can't sit with us. I kind of think about it in terms of like following a recipe. So for instance, when I follow a recipe, I don't like rules. Like, how dare you try and confine my creativity? So I will add slightly different ratios of things, like even when it comes to baking, and I know baking's supposed to be a science, but we're going to ignore that. Whereas my partner, he is very by the book. He's like, no, it says 2 tablespoons. We're adding 2 tablespoons. I'm like, can't we just eyeball it?
You can't with baking. So my wife, she is an amazing chef, cook. I don't know the right word for it. She does the same thing as you. She does not follow a direction. I am the baker, like scientific, especially when it comes to things I don't know, which is follow the recipe. Like last night, total side tangent here, she was like, "Oh, make macaroni and cheese real quick," and I was like, "Okay, like microwave it?" She's like, "No, how I make it." And she was like, 2 cups of milk. And she's like, "Well, it might be 2 cups. I don't know. I never measure." I'm like, literally, I filled the measuring cup so it hit the line of 2 cups because I was like, nope, that's how you do
Like down
it.
at eye level, making sure exact measurements are being followed here.
I'm a scientist when it comes to making food, and it looks like an explosion on the table after I'm done. So, and I would say the same thing with planning as well. You know, I get stuff out right now, and the next thing you know, it's like pens and stickers and stamps and ink, and my hands are covered, and it's like it's an experience for sure. Okay, the next myth that we heard, this actually came from several different people. This came from Carrie, the Blood Witch, and Road Rash as well. I agree that the biggest myth is about the time you need to do it. That we heard so much in the responses. Like that's the big myth. How do we overcome that? How do we get past that it takes a lot of time?
I think it's one of those things that, like, because this is such a personal, I don't know, journey. I'm going to say journey. It's a personal journey, you and your bullet journal. So I see it in the same way as, like, how long is a piece of string? How long do you want it to be?
Mm.
Like, if you want this to take time and if you want to go really in depth and in detail with things and decorate and do things that are time costly, then yeah, it'll take a lot of time. But if you want to just write things down very quickly in a book, like just rapid logging, original core collections, that kind of stuff, it doesn't have to take a lot of time.
That's a good way to think about it. All right, this next one from Anna is pretty good. I like this one a lot. The biggest myth I've heard when I first started out is that you can't use a pre-printed planner as a bullet journal. We did not talk about this one at all last time because it's never really come up for me, but you can bullet journal in anything.
No, I thought this was a really good one actually, because yeah, like you said, nobody else brought it up. But I think that, we talk a lot about the idea of like, oh, you just need a notebook and a pen. And I'm like, yeah, sure, okay, cool. But who says that the notebook has to have nothing in it? So if you have layouts that you know that you want to use and there's a notebook or a planner that already has that structure, then why not use one with pre-printed elements in it?
It makes a lot of sense. I've thought about it maybe a bullet journal or two ago. I thought about giving it a try. It's when I was trying to search for the right mix of what I was looking for. I just never gave it a go, but there's no reason why you couldn't. I mean, it's your bullet journal, your dots for your tasks and your dashes for your notes. Like nothing really changes about it. It's just the spaces are already created for you, right? The dates are already inside of the notebook. It doesn't, that's such a weird one that people would say that. I don't know why.
I think that the only potential area I could see it is maybe the purists lurking their heads out like, oh, I don't know about that, is the, I know, right, gremlin mode, is that because it is pre-printed, it predefines how much space you have for things, whereas the original bullet journal method, like you write your header for your daily, you write out as much as you need to, whether that's 5 lines or 5 pages, and then you move on to the next day. If you're using something pre-printed, then obviously that amount of space is kind of defined by whatever planner you're using, so...
Yeah, these next two are going to lead right into our next topic. This first one just makes me laugh because I think it has more to do with the space that we're in within stationery. So the myth that Journal Jonesies heard is that it costs a lot of money to bullet journal. And I laugh at that because if I think about how much money I've spent on stationery, you could say that that's correct. But the truth is that it really doesn't have to cost you anything to bullet journal because technically you could do it with what you already have at home. You don't have to buy more, but obviously you and I have a little bit of a notebook addiction problem and it adds up over time. But do you see that as a cause or effect of bullet journaling?
I think that one's tricky because I can totally understand why people on the outside looking in would think that it does cost a lot of money. Because especially if we think about social media, the beautiful beast that it is, and you have a whole bunch of creators sharing like, oh, hey, I got like XYZ notebook. I got this new pen. It cost me $100, like whatever. Then you can kind of start to think like, oh gosh, do I need those supplies to do this? But that's not necessarily how it has to be. You can get supplies that are budget friendly. You don't have to have, the latest notebook and the greatest fountain pen and all of this kind of stuff. You can have your, Bic pen and your El Cheapo lined notebook and be just fine.
Yeah, it could work out just well. What I can say is that one thing that I've appreciated more because of bullet journaling is kind of the finer quality, not always the best, right? expensive doesn't always mean better. I know that's a big thing I try to tell my kids all the time, but you do start to really appreciate the different like makes and models and like how something writes or how the paper is inside of a notebook. I just went through a whole project for myself getting rid of like the cheaper stuff or like kind of the crappier stuff that I didn't necessarily love. And I felt bad about it because I'm like, this is a waste. But then I was just giving it away to people. They're like, wait, you don't want this? I was like, I just don't prefer that pen or I don't prefer this notebook. Like, I'd rather someone else use it. All right. And this last question that we have is going to feed perfectly right into today's topic of can you bullet journal wrong? This one's coming from T Bean. I think the biggest myth in bullet journaling is that you can't tweak it or you just have to follow the rules. Let's go ahead and talk about that as we get into this topic, Jess. You can start because I'll let you take all the first fodder here. Is there a right way to bullet journal?
Like I kind of mentioned, I don't think there's necessarily a right way. Maybe there's like right ways, right? So I think that right is kind of dictated by person. You know, what is right for one may not be right for others. I also think that right isn't necessarily a static thing. Like right for me right now is very different to what it was a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, I was a teacher. I, had a job outside of the home, that kind of stuff. I was in a very different place in my life. So the stuff that I needed to make my bullet journal work then is going to be quite different to what I need to make it work now. So right, maybe not. Wrong, yes, I do think that there are wrong ways to bullet journal. I don't know, just off the bat, do you think that there is a right way?
So I do actually. We talked about this last time on like we do have different perspectives on this one. When you were like, go out, experiment, do that. You're starting, I really do just strongly, firmly believe that you should start with the basics. It's like you have to learn the rules before you can bend the rules. So I think that you should start there, at least to understand it. Maybe you don't have to use every single part of it or feel that you're obligated to, but I think understanding the rules and how it works is a really great foot forward, because I've come across a number of people in this community that make very beautiful and aesthetic what we would call bullet journals, right? It's just kind of the common term. It's the Kleenex of the facial tissue, right? And I'll ask them and say, hey, how did you come into the method, or what are you using? They're like, what do you mean the method? I'm like, wait, the bullet journal method, like you're calling this a bullet journal. You don't bullet journal? They're like, no, I just make these pages because people like my posts. And I'm like, like maybe that's a different kind of perspective on it, right? Because that's a creator doing that and just putting it out there. They don't actually understand. And the problem that I have with that personally, again, I would never hold it against them though, is that other people are then seeing that online, right? And then they are coming across these myths or what they think they have to do. Wait, I have to be able to doodle these cute characters and make these little cloud bubbles and put 3 tasks inside of that to have a bullet journal. And you don't. And so I think it just starts to lead people down this wrong path. So understanding the basics, I think, gives you that foundation, and then you can explore. So that way, if someone does ask you a question or you have an opinion to give, at least you're basing it off of what it is supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that if you're going to use the term bullet journal, it probably pays to know, quote, what a bullet journal is. It's tricky when people see these very artistic layouts online and stuff. They're like, oh, I'm going to do that too. And then because the original creator called it a bullet journal, they're now calling it a bullet journal. It's that kind of like Chinese whispers, chain of effect type deal.
Yeah, and I think also people get confused too because they see most people using dot grid journals with a bullet journal, and so they see the dots and they call those bullets, and so they just think if it's a dot grid journal then it's a bullet journal. The thing is I've had people reach out to me, companies and brands, that are like, oh yes, we created a bullet journal and it's just a notebook with just the dot grids, right? They are even referring to their own product, even though they shouldn't be. Someone will come after you, as a bullet journal, when in reality it's the dot grid notebook.
And then you have people in the community asking like, oh, well, if I'm using a lined notebook, can that be a bullet journal? Because the kind of perspective that they've taken is it's not bullets or a dot grid, thus it can't be a bullet journal, when really it's not from that. It's from the rapid logging and the kind of key used in that, the bulleted list.
Yeah, I kind of want to do a bullet journal one time in a line notebook because I think it makes a lot of sense, especially if you're writing task and notes. It's already there if you don't like to have those different pieces. I know there's a number of people who have started to really take on line journals because they like a bit of long form, short form, as well as bullet journaling inside of there, which kind of makes it everything you want it to be.
Yeah, my biggest issue is the vertical alignment because I'm a big fan of columns of text. And if my column starts to get a little skew if cattywampus, I'm just like, oh, no, 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 get yourself back in line.
I'm the same way. I've tried to do that just to like experiment and see what it's like. Too much measurement needs to happen to make horizontal line notebooks into bullet journals for me
Yeah.
personally, because I'm right there with you. So what about you, Jess? What do you think about there being a wrong way to bullet journal?
So I think there's actually kind of like 6 ways that you could be bullet journaling wrong.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me put on my seatbelt here.
Yeah, that's right. All right, we're strapping in 6 different ways that you can bullet journal incorrectly. The first one I think would have to be turning your bullet journal into a glorified task list. We did touch on this in the last episode, but that's honestly this is something that I've fallen victim to as well. So if you are just using your bullet journal for tasks, don't think like, oh, Jess is calling me out on the internet. How dare she? I'm gonna go hide back into my not bullet journaling hole. No, not that. Part of the bullet journal method, right, not just the bullet journal practice, but the bullet journal method as a whole involves that reflective aspect, the mindfulness aspect. If you are just writing down a list of stuff that you need to get done and not spending any time thinking about, well, do I actually need to do it? Why is this important? Then you might not be bullet journaling correctly.
That's definitely a thing that I have learned. I mentioned that last episode when I started to work and get more involved in the actual bullet journal official community, when they talked about taking on like reflection and intention and things like that. They talk about that a lot in the bullet journal method, in the book, in the courses, and everything else. I feel like recently they've actually been leaning into that a bit more, perhaps as a way to differentiate themselves in this general like notebook kind of community, right? And really focusing it on that method. I was thinking back to when I first started, I didn't do any type of long or short form journaling. I did keep all the collection pages though, and was keeping notes and tasks in there. So I guess how important do you personally feel that reflection, that intention part of it makes or breaks bullet journaling?
Well, it's hard because in kind of like separating my bullet journal thoughts from my just general life thoughts, in general life, I think reflection is hugely important. Probably helps from the fact that I was a teacher of the MYP and the IB. If you know, you know, right?
I don't know.
Then you're safe. But reflection was very much baked into a lot of the processes throughout that kind of like learning program. So I kind of latched onto that a little bit, brought it into my regular life, and I do reflection on, like a fortnightly or weekly basis. I do it on my cyclic or monthly basis. I'm up there with like my quarterly and annual reviews and stuff. And this is all just personal reviews. This isn't like a professional review system or anything like that. But I find that reflection is so important for being able to be intentional moving forward. I think where reflection kind of gets a bad rap is that people like think it's pointless. Like, oh, I'm gonna, go through all these questions and stuff, and it's gonna take all of this time and wah wah. I'm like, yeah, but then what are you gonna do with it? Like, if you actually do something with it, then the time spent was worthwhile. It doesn't feel like a waste of time anymore. So I'm a big fan of reflection already. So then bringing that into the bullet journal method, once I actually started to research this and figure that it's not just a glorified task list, like there is more to this, that was something that really sold me on the idea. So I think it's quite important.
It's one of those things that I don't usually think about, but I was just telling you right before we got started about this guided manifestation journal that a follower had sent to me that they self-published, which was pretty cool. But there was a part of that that I really liked, because here's where I fall into it. I think a lot of people probably don't do a lot of that because they don't know how to. And that's definitely where I fall into. Now I know how to set an intention and how to reflect on that, because it's pretty easy. Like, what do I want to do? And then how did it go? And what do I want to continue or stop doing? Like that I get. There was a thing in here that talked about like when you're starting one of those tasks or a goal, what risks are potentially in front of me? And then the follow-up is, how can I overcome those risks? And it was just really insightful for me because I had to stop for a second. And this is, I think, maybe what you're talking about here with that intentionality, is stopping for a second to actually think about what you're doing or how you're doing that. If something doesn't go right and you're using your bullet journal to capture all of those things, whether it be projects or tasks or notes. I think about work a lot because that's where I use mine. Usually it would just be like, oh, just turn the page and, keep running down my list of things. But something that I've found so helpful, and I still do it every now and again, is just go back through my bullet journals and just reread the past few weeks, especially if things are looking down, because sometimes you can catch these little notes or commonalities or things that are happening to be like, whoa, actually, this is where things started to go downhill. I can see based off of what was happening in my life or these notes I was taking about things that were going down. And that isn't something I feel like you just get naturally. You do have to kind of reread it, I feel like, to really get that full bit out of there.
And kind of going into it with that perspective of not necessarily hunting for them or looking out for them, but if you've recorded it, it's there, and then you have the opportunity to kind of like learn from that. If you capture thoughts and feelings and notes and stuff like that in your journal along with just tasks, then it's effectively like a record of your journey. I love looking back on my old journals and seeing any little notes I wrote for myself. Anything that was a task, it's like, oh yay, woo for you got something done, no biggie. Whereas if I go and have a look at those little, because I use little exclamation points for my notes, and say like, oh, today was lame because blah, blah, blah. And you kind of like cast your mind back like, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember that feeling. Or even the good ones. It's like, oh yeah, today was really awesome because we went to the lavender fields and we were going to go stargazing, but there was too many clouds. Like, whatever. Yes, this is a specific memory, but
I would say that is very dreamy. I'm like, oh, I've never written anything like that. I want to go lay in a lavender field.
it was great, except for the clouds, and then it started raining. We're like, okay, well, we trekked all the way out here for nothing, but at least it was like a good time with friends.
So something that you mentioned last episode that really stuck with me, especially around tracking and kind of paying attention to things, was this idea of your journal just being performative. I was curious because I know that's something that we've talked about. I was like, right or wrong, like how are you actually utilizing it? What are your further thoughts on that? Because we did only touched on it. You blew my mind. I've had some time to think about it. I'm very curious if you could kind of dig into that a little bit deeper for us.
Because this is another one of the ways that I think that people could be bullet journaling wrong, making it performative, especially if you're sharing your journal online, because much to our best efforts, there is a little bit of a change that happens often with the way that you do your bullet journaling, the way that you use your journal, if you're going to be snapping a picture of it and sharing it on the internet. Some of us share more than others, but you always have to be careful about what you share. That's like a whole nother story. But when you're trying to get likes or views or follows or whatever else, it does start to kind of lead you down the path of following a trend or putting in a layout because it looks nice rather than it's actually functional and bringing something into your life. I know that for me, that would be like a mood tracker. When I first started doing mood tracking, there was probably a very large part of it that was just, hey, this is a decorative piece that I can put online and it'll get some likes. I don't really need to track my moods. I know that there are people who do get a lot of value from that, but for what I was using that information for, well, I wasn't using that information, so there. But when you do this too much, it means that you're just putting all of these things into your journal that are really for other people than rather for yourself. And that's where the kind of performative thing comes in. And you're setting up all of these layouts, spending this time and energy and effort for something that isn't really going to have a lot of payoff for you outside of maybe vanity metrics.
I think for myself, when I create my bullet journal, I am thinking about functionality. And then usually I've in the past have tried to include things I was seeing online. And I did it and then realized it wasn't for me. Similar to your tracker where you're like, I must have died. I have one that I always think about, which was like a little calendar tracker for me working out. Blue if I worked out that day, red if I didn't, and every single day had a red dot inside of it. And I was just like, well, what's the point of this? It's like you said, am I doing this just to make myself feel bad? I think there's a level of accountability that does come along with those that's really helpful, but only if you're going to use that information. Like you really opened up my mind to thinking about how and what I'm doing with tracking and what I'm paying attention to for myself. I've definitely changed over time. When I look back through probably the first 2-3 years, there was a lot of that. And then recently, I don't know the last time I've put any type of tracker inside of my bullet journal other than like the capacity tracker, which I do, which is a very functional need that I use it for work. And I use that data week over week, month over month, year over year for my team. So it has a bigger purpose to it. So that's there every week, but I'm not tracking sleep. I'm not doing anything like that. I do want to get back into tracking like favorite songs of the week, because I've had a few of those that I did for like 3 or 4 weeks in a past bullet journal. And just recently I was going back through my journals and I was like, I haven't listened to that song in forever. Like, this was the hotness and I love it. And it's been cool to like add it back into my playlist, because it's like a very cool nostalgic thing. Be like, yeah, I love this song. Why did I ever stop listening to it?
I recently just set up a kind of page in my long-term collections journal, just being songs I love, and just wrote down all of the ones, and all like through writing them, like, I haven't listened to this in ages. Why am I listening to this? I love this song. I exactly know what you feel about that.
Yeah. And when we talk about kind of decorating, adding things to your page and all of this, another thing that you had on your list, which I think is incredibly strong, is perfectionism, because I know that holds a lot of people back. I know that it discourages a lot of people. So could you go into that a little bit more about how doing that or trying to be perfectionist is a wrong way of going about bullet journaling?
Yeah, I 100%, hands down, still suffer from this myself. I still have thoughts like, oh, I need to take down a messy list or whatnot. Well, I'm not going to do it in my bullet journal because it won't look good. Like, and, of course there is a part of that. You're sharing it on social media. You want it to look nice. You want people to like, follow, subscribe, rah, rah, rah. But if the journal is supposed to be there to help you do X, Y, Z, then you need to let it do X, Y, Z, right? So for me, that would be very much around the kind of decorative style planning is usually where we see the perfectionism kind of sneak into it. It's like, oh, I really want to do a galaxy theme in my journal, but I don't think I can paint a galaxy or draw a galaxy. Am I talking about myself? Yes, I am talking about myself. I would love to do a galaxy theme, but in my mind, I've set this kind of barrier, like, you can only do a galaxy theme when you know how to watercolor, and you don't know how to watercolor, so you're not allowed to do it. Why would you set that kind of restriction on yourself? Again, I'm talking to myself. Why would I set that kind of restriction on myself? If you want to do it and it's going to bring you joy to do the process, like, to put it politely, who gives a fuck if it's not perfect?
Well, I think because a big part of it, you said it a few times now, is this idea that we feel as if we have to share a bullet journal for it to be a bullet journal. And people don't want to be real in their bullet journals because they're going to post it online. Early on, I was the same way, but I can honestly say now that I gave up on that a while ago. And I've actually found more people that are like, I relate to this now. You have stuff crossed out. Like, there's times when I write a note and I'm like, Mark, your handwriting, like, not even like it's not pretty handwriting. Like, I can't read my own handwriting. And I'm like crossing it out. I have to rewrite it because I'm like, I was just writing so fast. But seeing a real bullet journal, I love it. I love after the pages. I love seeing a well-used, messy notebook. I also love seeing beautiful handwriting that looks like someone typed it instead of wrote it as well. I have appreciation for that. And I just keep thinking back to, instead of saying, why are you spending so much time doing that? I say that must be something that they want to work on for themselves, and good for them for taking the time to do that, because it takes a lot of practice. I don't think realize that. Like, if you want nice handwriting, you can't just chicken scratch it down and be like, why isn't my handwriting great? It's not the pen always that makes the writer, right? But it's very much so where you're taking the time and practice into doing that. And just the reality is that it's not perfect. Like, you're going to make a mistake. Or if you're using fountain pens, like, it could smear, or even some inky pens do the same thing. I'm not going to rip out my page because I got ink smeared on it. Like, it just looks like that now.
I love your point about looking at people who, do very artistic bullet journals or journals that take a lot of time and stuff, and rather than thinking like, wow, I don't have the time to, or I could never spend the time to, but more so being more of a feeling of support in the way that, like, hey, I love that that is something that is of value to you and that you are spending the time to do something you love. I think that that's valuable, because I think that what a lot of people who comment saying, oh, I don't have the time to, or I could never have the time to, they might not realize is that when you pitch it in that way, it does come off as you telling that person you are spending your time wrong. Even if it's not intentional, that is kind of the undertone subtext of that kind of comment. We had this when I shared my friend's journal, actually, on my channel. Shout out to Bibliophile by Night, Monica. She does amazing reading journal content, and a lot of the comments, not too many, but some of the purists popping their head out like, ugh. It's like, oh wow, does she even have a life outside of her journal? Like, this must have taken so much time. It's like, okay, calm down, first of all. But just because she prioritizes this is her hobby and she makes time for it, just because that isn't the way that you do things doesn't mean that it's wrong.
Absolutely. I think this is so true just in life in general. We see people that have nice things or they spend extra time on that. And people say that. I think the best example that I have of this is if someone is jealous, they have a nicer house, they have a nicer car than I do. They're rich, they're snobby, they're this or that. But if you actually go down a level deeper, and I'm going to speak from somewhat personal experience here, when you see that, those people who have those nicer things have prioritized differently. Maybe they don't spend as much money on random things. Maybe they don't go out as much. They've made that something that they want to prioritize and do versus the other person who does not have that, maybe is blowing that money differently. Maybe you have a vice that you spend your extra money on to do that. Perhaps you choose to live a different way or have a certain job or do things like that. I know that not all of that is controlled. I'm just trying to use that as an example. It's very similar when someone says, like, I could never do that. I don't have the time for that. Okay, do you want to do that? I guess is the big thing. Because if you do, maybe you want to go ahead and write down and time track and see where you are spending your time. Because otherwise it comes off exactly like you said, very persnickety and just, putting your nose up to something that is extremely helpful for someone else. Like just because you choose not to spend your time that way does not mean that it is time not well spent.
No, I completely agree with what you've said there because if I think about it in terms of my situation, I have a friend who does a lot of travel. She sees amazing places. She also hikes. I do not do that, notably, but I always get to see her pictures online and see all of these great places she's been. And I'm like, oh my gosh, why can't I do that? I'm like, well, let's just ignore the fact that you don't hike. So you're not going to get up to the top of that mountain, at least not without a car, but it's fine. She's just prioritizing the way that she spends her resources, time, energy, money, all of that differently to how I'm doing mine. I own my own home. She is renting. So there's flexibility in that. I have different hobbies and passions that I spend my time, energy, and resources on. She doesn't because hiking and traveling, those are her passions, her hobbies. If there was a point in my life that I decided that was more important to me, then sure, I'm going to spend my resources, energy, all of that differently. But right now, that's not what I'm doing. I suppose that kind of brings me to the next way that you might be bullet journaling wrong, and this has again happened to me as well, but not updating your journal for your different life situation, or not changing what you're doing in your journal because your situation has changed. Have you ever suffered from that one?
I most certainly have, because when I was just going through my bullet journal the other day, I was looking at my pages and I was thinking, Mark, you were able to capture a day in an A5 notebook in one vertical column. How did you do that? So when I first started, and probably over the past few years, and I would set up my weekly, I was actually able to keep everything inside of a weekly. I didn't have as many tasks or notes as I do now. And I would say probably over the past 2 years, I've seen a major change in how I've bullet journaled and how I've used the space in there, where it was maybe a handful of tasks and not a whole lot of notes, moving to really truly rapid logging and keeping everything within that page and feeling also very comfortable in that if I have to go beyond my weekly pages, that's totally okay. So I don't plan ahead past my week. So any notes that come after that week are either collection pages or additional notes to what I already have. And early on, I think I used to feel like I had to keep it that way. But then as my role changed and life changed, I needed to also change the way in which I bullet journal. And a lot of that was like, well, Mark, maybe a weekly spread that way isn't right for you. Maybe you just need an overview and then leave whatever pages you need. Because in an A5 journal, my last bullet journal that I used, that I was probably using close to maybe 4 to 5 pages a week. just based off of tasks and notes and everything going on. And I had collection pages too, but like that's just kind of what my life and my work needed from me. And if I would have kept it the way I used to do it, it would have never worked because I would have been trying to write in the margins to keep it on like one page. And that just wasn't going to happen for me. So I think changing for my life is probably one of the biggest impacts for me. And I think for other people as well to know that you need your bullet journal should change with you because you don't necessarily stop. I think about a lot of the people who are like, note, what do we call the people who are like take notes in journals? And they have like a whole subgenre with journaling as well.
Oh, so like studygram.
Exactly. Yes. And so what I mean by that, I could never think of that ever in my entire life. But I've seen a lot of people that have tried to make that transition from their college study gram into professional. And some of them have to stop their account. They have over 1 million followers. Someone specifically on YouTube, I remember seeing this, and they were like, so I graduated med school. I'm not going to continue this channel anymore because my life has changed. I'm no longer doing that. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, can you imagine building a community and a platform and then no longer taking notes? In my mind, I thought, well, aren't you doing continuous learning in your new role? Don't you have to pay attention to the things that you're doing? Like, this is what I hope people see from me. I'm sure they see it from you as well that have been following you for a while. You have matured and you have grown over time, as we should. And whatever system or planner or anything that you're using, in my opinion, should be able to do that with you.
Yeah, it's that idea of a pivot, not a quit. If we think about it in terms of their social media following, you've built up a community around you, and even though they obviously come to you for a certain service, they're coming to you to see that content, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily take them with you when you're going somewhere else. Provided you're not like, making a studygram account or whatnot, and the next day you're like, okay guys, now we're just gonna do like traditional cooking. It's like, okay, you're probably gonna get a fairly big drop off in that. But like you said, there is still a need to take notes in adult quote quote life. There's still a need to have that kind of information management and stuff. So can we kind of pivot it away from learning notes in a kind of more traditional like tertiary format or high school format into something that's a little bit different, lifelong learners type deal?
Absolutely. I think that really goes into another point that you made about this was that you have to make it your own. And do you mean this, that if you're not making it your own, it's the wrong way to bullet journal? Or what was your idea on this one? I'm very curious because we've talked a lot from a creator perspective of people who I want to say copy like exact pieces or maybe reuse themes. I feel like you've probably seen this more than I have because you're the theme queen in my mind, or had been. I honestly can say I've seen a shift from me even watching you over the years and how that you've been journaling recently, which I love because we're talking about it now. It's a full circle moment. But what are your thoughts on like not making it your own? How is that bullet journaling wrong, perhaps?
So I don't think of it in terms so much of the idea of like copying or recreation or anything like that. You don't have to go out and make a completely never seen before, super different anything in your journal. But more so, I like to think about it in terms of you don't want to be a copier, you want to be like a curator. Yeah. So instead of taking somebody's layout or, somebody's setup and copying it spread for spread, word for word, this has happened before. I had somebody copy my gratitude log, like exactly. Like they put my partner's name in their gratitude log. I'm like,
What?
I'm glad you're grateful for Vogel, but like, no, he's mine. Back off.
That is so interesting. I mean, it's weird, but it's also so interesting.
Yeah, I think that they were probably trying to do it from a like lettering practice point of view because there were a bunch of different lettering styles in there. But it was kind of funny seeing somebody post like, "Oh yeah, here's my gratitude log." I'm like, here's my gratitude log. Where did you get this photo of me? But fine.
How did you catch me in my backyard in my bathrobe? That's going a little too far.
It was a little bit strange, but see, that's the thing. If you're going to make a gratitude log, make sure that it's things that you are actually grateful for. Again, if you're grateful for Vogel, sure, put him in your gratitude log. Little weird, but you do you, boo. When you go to, make your bullet journal collections, populate them, all of this kind of thing, it is totally fine to get inspiration from other people online. That is why they're sharing it with you. Just make sure that if you're bringing it into your own personal space, it is actually something that serves you.
That's a very, very good point. I can understand understand it to a certain extent, I guess, if you're practicing or doing that, but it does feel a little odd to do it word for word. Like if it's a my favorite movies collection or things like that, like to think that somebody was like writing down all of your, again, inspiration. Maybe they want to see if that is their favorite movie, but definitely making it your own or trying it. I guess I was thinking about it that way up front because we've talked a lot in the general creative community around recreation or copying, and is that original content. I don't feel like anymore maybe it's as much as a conversation as it's used to, as this community has also matured and evolved as well, and I just don't feel like we see it a lot. But I guess I've never thought about people doing that because it seems weird to write something in your journal that is someone else's life.
Yeah, I will say that this isn't something that I have necessarily done for myself, but it is something that I've seen in the wider bullet journal community. You see a lot of people who do a recreation almost perfectly, like to the extent where it's not so much inspiration, it is very much recreation. And again, that's fine if it's going to be something that serves you and if you give credit to the original. The number of people I come across, I'm like, I swear I've seen this before. And it's like, okay, there's no credit. Maybe I'm just, deja vuing it. It's like, no, this is certainly by somebody else.
So we've gone through 5. I feel like it's taken us a while to go through these, but I've loved the absolute conversation. So if I've counted them all correctly, so we've talked about just using a bullet journal as a glorified list, letting perfectionism hold us back and really not focusing on that. You're not bullet journaling correctly if it's just strictly performative. You're not actually doing a lot with that information you're putting into it, not updating it for yourself in your life, not making it your own. We just talked about number 6. This is your last one, Jess. What is it?
Number 6, I feel like, is the most important one. And I think that this is something that maybe all of us are a little bit guilty of, but it would be not taking action. If you're going to write all of these things in your journal, you're using it to capture the things you want to do, thoughts, feelings, dreams, wishes, hopes, all of that. Love it. Let's go do the thing though. If we're just sitting there making lists in a book, there is merit to that. But unless we actually take action on it, then nothing's actually going to happen, right? If this stuff is important to you, if you want it to get done, sorry to say this, but you have to do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. I guess it's one thing to maybe forget, or I am a hardcore procrastinator and I know it. So it's self-awareness. I know that I don't want to do that task because it maybe doesn't seem as fun as the other ones. But it would feel odd to me, I guess, to think that I would ever write anything down intentionally, but never actually do it. I guess that really, for me, falls into the performative. You are only creating that for the sake of sharing it and not actually using your bullet journal for what it's worth. I'm curious, probably there's a lot of people that fall into that.
And for me, it's not so much that every single thing you write down is going to be something you do. Sometimes we have to write it down to get it out of our head, give ourselves some kind of distance between us and the thing. We'll just say task. Some distance between you and the task, just so that you can actually ruminate on it a little bit and say, well, do I actually want to do this? Most of those things that I write down that aren't, right now tasks or this week or this month, they go in what I call my future me problems list. So it's just stuff that future me is going to deal with. And I like to make a new future me problems list every year, mainly so that I can do that reflective process, get to the end of the year, go through the list and say, well, you wrote all these things down. How many of them actually still matter? And it's all right if some of those get crossed off. I mean, that's why we have a cancelled task kind of symbol in the bullet journal method. But having that written down, giving yourself some distance, and then deciding not to do it is better than just leaving it in your head and thinking like, oh, I should do that, I should do that, I should do that, never taking the time to analyze it a little bit more closely.
Yeah, I can agree with you there.
So those are my 6 wrong ways to bullet journal. But I guess, Mark, what do you think a bullet journal has to have? Like, what are the must-haves in a bullet journal for it to be a bullet journal?
So this is where I think people might get upset. Maybe they won't. I mean, this is a general conversation, and a lot of people have called this out, and I have to say, like, I really appreciate that we have a difference of opinion here. Now, yours were much more well thought out than mine when it comes to this, because the way that I look at it, I think it really does come down to using the bullet journal method for you to be bullet journaling. So to me, if you're not doing these things, then you're not bullet journaling. A lot of them are just foundational. So this one, I've pulled back on this a little bit after our past conversations, but I really strongly personally believe that using an index in a bullet journal is a must have. And the reason that I think that, though, is because from a method perspective, and I see this because I know that it's helped me so much. If you need to find something quickly, if you need to refer to something quickly, being able to look in your index and find that topic and that page is much faster than trying to flip through all of your different pages inside of your bullet journal. And so I say that in just like, I just personally believe that if you're going to be bullet journaling, that an index is really important. But I will say, just because of our conversations, if you come to a point where you just feel like it is painful for you to do that, or you're just not finding any benefit in that at all, then don't. I don't want to make it sound like you're not a bullet journal if you don't do those things, because a lot of my things are going to sound very troll like bullet journal purist trolls. But I mean this with love instead of hatred, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I love to hear that about like your take on the index as well and how it's kind of changed from our conversation, because I was very much thinking about it after the fact too. Like, oh gosh, like should I be using an index? Am I missing out on something because I'm not using an index? But I think that because of the way I like to do things, because of the separation that I like to have between all of my different life areas, it does make sense that some of my journals have an index and some don't. But 100% agree, like you don't want to be wasting your time flipping through your journal to try and find things, especially if you've leaned into that idea of bullet journaling can be an all-in-one. If you have every single thing, you know, every collection, every shopping list, every note from work, whatever else in one notebook, the index does become kind of integral to making sure that you can navigate effectively.
And it's been something for me personally that I've just gotten so much value out of. I think that if maybe I wouldn't, maybe I feel differently, maybe that comes across selfish. I don't know the right word for it. Like, because I found value, therefore everyone else should find value in it. I just use myself as this use case because I know who I was and where I was struggling before I came into bullet journaling. And I know the power and the value that I've gotten out of it. It literally has changed my life for the better on so many different fronts. Less about like the social media part. I love that part. I love the community. But at its base, I have had so much benefit from it. Like, I don't know how to say it, that it's just one of those things. If I ever hear anybody struggling, I'm like, you should give it a try, because as a person who thought the same thing, we talked about it last episode, I was like, hell no, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. That's too much stuff. Now I don't even have to look at it anymore. It just is built into my brain and it works. So that's one of the reasons I feel like that is important, because I used to be that person, would be like, oh gosh, you asked me about whatever. Oh, hold on a second. And you feel so stressed out about it, versus now I'd be like, oh, sure, 1 second. And I flip to it and they're like, wait a second, like you found your notes right away. And I'm like, let me tell you about my savior, the bullet journal. That literally has changed the way that I work and do things. So it's just been really valuable to me overall.
Yeah, it's one of those things like when you find something that works for you, you know, whether it's bullet journaling or like something else, you want to share it with other people and you want them to kind of hit the ground running with it, get it right, quote, quote. But when we go and share these things, it's like we're not necessarily taking other people's perspectives into account. And that's not like necessarily a bad thing, right? Well, it might be. But when we're trying to share it, we're trying to share it from a place of this really worked for me. I want you to know exactly what I've done so that you can do that too. Like you said, your index works really well for you. You like to be able to, like, you know, flip to whichever page very, very quickly, find something. I know that for my everyday journal, everything is chronological. So it's like, I took it down in February. It's in my February section. I don't really need an index to point me in the right direction.
Well, you also, I don't know if this is that journal for you specifically, but I know in the past you've done a lot with like tabs and like visuals that help you easily find what you're looking for. Is that in that journal that you have, where you have a lot of those like call out visual flags that like help you find that quickly?
Yeah, I have previously. Mainly for me, tabs nowadays are kind of what I would call like internal tabs. So they don't stick out the side of the journal. There's no kind of like external flagging of like, hey, this information is here. But previously, I had one journal where I washi taped the side of every single page.
Every page.
I know, every single page. It was so chonky. It was beautiful though, but very chonky. So that I could say like, oh look, all of 1 month is right here. So there are other ways to kind of signal or navigate your journal outside of the index. But as far as simplicity, the index is probably the most straightforward, which makes sense. It's part of the original method.
Yeah, and my second point, I'm going to just kind of gloss over this one real quick, is about the future log because I personally have had struggles with it. When I first started, I was all about it, kept everything in there. Great. Talked about last time where, I was really struggling from a bad perspective where I wrote one thing in it and that was it. To now it having a change for me. So, a really big thing that I think is important is utilizing that or finding a way to utilize the future log because where else are you keeping the things you have to plan ahead for? So for myself, if someone says to me, Mark, I need you to present at the June all hands, I'm not going to rewrite that in my weekly every single week until June. That doesn't make sense. So where am I putting that? Where is that going? So there is value in it. And yes, I have changed it from the original method, but again, I started with the original and then have evolved from there versus starting with a calendar and all this crazy stuff. I think really what it comes down to for me personally with the future log is the same thing I said before. Understand how it's supposed to work before you try to change it. And that way, regardless of what you do with it, you're still keeping the foundation there of its purpose and using it for its purpose. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I understand that. And I also think that that kind of ties into what we talked about before, like, can you bullet journal wrong? Like, making it your own and updating it for when life changes. So, like, you've come to realize that the style that Ryder originally shared isn't a style that resonates as well with you. Like, you prefer having those calendar layouts, actually being able to, like, see the weeks and months kind of broken down. So, using that, and then because it's something that actually resonates with you, actually using it is going to be a lot better than having the very traditional style.
Yes, exactly it. And that goes into my next point is, to bullet journal, you do need to utilize the bullet. And by that, I do not mean the bullets on the page and drawing things out. I mean actually using the signifiers, at least using the main ones. There's a lot of different ways you can go about using signifiers, and that is their purpose. But making sure that you are rapid logging, you're writing down your task and your notes with an intention to them. Now, I don't mean you have to journal about each thing that you write, but again, you are doing that so that you take an action like we just talked about. It's definitely a place that we agree. For me, I'm just bare bones in it over here, not saying it as nice, but utilizing that in there is a key part of bullet journaling. Again, it was something that scared me a lot. It took me a very long time to try to understand what each of those signifiers were, because I feel like in life, we're always taught that a dash is like a bulleted list. But that's not how the bullet journal method is. You don't write a bullet to put a note next to it. Like a bullet is a task, is an action. So to rewire my brain to think that way did take me a little bit. But once you get it, like I said last time, when I took my bullet journal break, when I was just at it, I was still bulleting tasks on a sticky note. I was still dashing for a note. For myself, I have definitely changed like an open circle from an event to a triangle that I use for meetings because that makes more sense for me. And I also can't mistake my slightly open circle and my big fat dot as the same thing. I've had to change it due to myself there. But I do think that's an incredibly important part of the method is utilizing those signifiers and really understanding the practice of rapid logging because there is such a benefit to it.
Yeah, I think that of the parts that we've talked about so far, the rapid logging for me is the part that is like, it's not a bullet journal unless. And I don't want to be the persnickety biscuit purists who are like, what are you talking about? You can't be doing that over there.
Watch
But
out, it's the Jess troll coming out from her bullet journal bridge.
pay the toll. But I do think that rapid logging is probably the most integral part for me. Like, that's where it got its name, so it is kind of important. I have, though, taken the original bullets and tweaked them a little bit, kind of like you. So I use a regular dot for a task, that one's fine. But for a note, I don't do a dash because I use a dash for anything that I've cancelled. I don't like the look of crossing something out completely because I cannot draw a straight line that is that long. And I'm like, nope, it's going to look messy. You're not going to use your journal if it looks messy, so we're just going to cross out the bullet itself. So for me, a note is now an exclamation point. It's like, hey, pay attention. Bam, I'm here. I've also made the events a larger circle than Ryder has for himself. I know that he also does a lot of event taking down after the fact, though. It's more of like a memory keeping thing for him rather than a pre-planning thing. And I use my events for kind of pre-planning. So mine's just like a larger circle that I can then check off with a little check mark.
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that's why I think I had to move away from using like a larger open circle versus the dots because they conflicted. But something that you just mentioned there about taking track of things afterwards. I don't actually talk about this collection page as much anymore because I stopped doing them because it felt repetitive to me. Was that monthly overview page, in the traditional bullet journal method, for anyone that's not familiar, and if you are, you know what I'm talking about, the 1 through 30 days of the week, like idea per line. Because in my mind, that was that future planning part. I can't fit more than one event on there, and I have multiple meetings or things I have to remember throughout the weeks. And then I'm also keeping a daily or a future log, and it felt repetitive. But I remember actually through the bullet journal basics course that I took, it was like, you don't have to use that page as forward planning, use that as reflection on things that have happened. And I was like, that's a good idea, but I'm just going to do that in the daily. I'm not going to do that in that monthly. Now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, Mark, your reasons to bullet journal are very specific to how you bullet journal and not to the method. But just for me, I guess the thing is that I have done that for a very long time because that was the method I was taught. And I feel very strongly, clearly, as we've talked about this, that you need to follow that before you can decide not to do it. Like, let the method work and discover what doesn't work for you versus not. However, I do believe, though, that the collection pages as a whole are very important, but utilizing them the right way is kind of, for me personally, something that is really key for bullet journaling. And collection pages, for those, I think we hit on it just a little bit, but it's just these ideas of like liked objects grouped together, especially if you are daily logging or weekly logging and rapid logging just as a whole, all the loggings. When you start to get liked ideas, sometimes it's better for your brain to pull that all into one page than it is to try to flip back 1,000 times to try to find things. I think also, and for myself personally here, when those collection pages have become important, has to do with that reflection that I was talking about earlier, and actually going back and reading your past few weeks to capture ideas. I catch a lot of common themes and I go, oh, Mark, okay, you talked to this person about this project. You also talked to this person about the same project. Well, now we have enough information here really to start to build out a collection page for this, because now we have more than just an idea or a thought or one note. And for me, it's super helpful there. And so I think it is important to really just think about something like that. Again, I love ideas of, you have reoccurring meetings, those having collection pages and being able to refer just back to that one main collection page for every time you need to write down another note for that. I don't know, do you use collection pages in the same way, or do you have a different approach, or do you feel like a collection page is even necessary to be considered a bullet journal?
Well, I think that if we go from the definition that you pitched us, a collection page is a grouping of like ideas, all right? So a shopping list, if you write it in your journal, is a collection, all right? You've got all of the things that you need to buy at the shop. Makes sense. If you want to list out like your goals or anything, then you've got a collection of your goals all together. Makes sense. But an index is also a collection because it's a list of all of the things contained in your notebook and hopefully where to find them. Otherwise, it's a very odd index. Your future log is technically a collection as well because it is a collection of all of the things that are going on in the future. So by that kind of point of view, I don't think you can bullet journal if you don't have collections, because either your notebook is blank because you don't have anything in there, or you've just put everything into kind of like a jumble soup, so tasks, notes, events, all of that, just like in one long running thing from the first page to the back. Then it's not so much, well, I guess you could say it's a collection, but it's more like the junk drawer of collections. So I do think that collections are necessary. How you structure them, though, I think that there can be a bit of flexibility in that. I know that Ryder talks about the idea of like, you flip to the next available page and you start writing things down. Oftentimes, I won't flip to the next available page. I'll just put it on the same page and draw a box around it. Because I set up what I call micro collections. They're things that realistically, they do not need a full page because there's going to be like 8 items on the list, and I'm not going to use an entire page in my notebook for that.
Yeah, I think my big thing, and kind of where I'll kind of put myself to bed here, if other people haven't already decided that they're no longer like me because of these things, is just my big point here really is just that the bullet journal method works because it is a method. It's like anything else. I can't just go into a yoga studio and do a few stretches and be done with that, right? Yoga, for this example, is so much more than just these different poses and stretching, right? There's a mindfulness about it. There's a strength part of this. It's tapping into a different part of you that makes sense. And that works because it is a method, right? Someone has created that, thought about it, practiced it, done it, refined it. I feel the same way about the bullet journal method. And I've even seen the bullet journal, official bullet journal change. I've seen Ryder change over the years of how he has perceived bullet journaling, and then seeing how it is now is a totally different thing. And I actually give that team a lot of props because they've taken something that really was an idea and a notebook, watched it evolve within this community, and now have built their own community practice and even learning about it, which is incredible. So they're kind of their own example of how your bullet journal needs to evolve with you, because they've also evolved over time as well.
Yeah, I love the point about that. It's like the yoga studio, because that's not necessarily where my mind would go to. My mind goes to, do you know the picture of the guy who's like pointing at the butterfly, being like, is this a bullet journal?
No, I haven't seen that.
We're going to chuck it up on the screen. If you're here on YouTube, you get to see it.
Okay.
But I always go to kind of extremes. I'm like, okay, if somebody presented me a bowl of alphabet soup and said, this is my bullet journal, I'd look at them like, okay, dear. Whatever you say, friendo. Yeah, so a bullet journal, I guess we could say, like, is it a sum of its parts, or is there more to it than that? Like, you know, if you rapid log in a notebook, are you bullet journaling? And I would go, maybe no, possibly. Like, if it's just rapid logging by itself, it's not really a bullet journal. There are other parts that you need to put into there. If we're doing the method as a whole, like, there needs to be that mindfulness, that intentionality, like you mentioned with the yoga, which is a great example, by the way.
I don't know why that one. Probably because I always said to myself, Mark, you would really like that. Like, you would like that because it involves a lot of things that you need in your life. I just never make the time to do it, right? Like we talked about before, I don't hate on people that do yoga. I actually very much appreciate the people who wake up an hour earlier to spend that time with themselves. Like, it's just not been a priority, but it, to me, is one of those things that makes a lot of sense because people see it as a fad, similar to how bullet journal has been, or, oh, everyone's doing it, but they don't actually understand what actually goes into it and the reason why it is what it is to really gain the benefits from it.
Yeah, while I won't hate on people who do yoga, I will hate on yoga because I find it really bloody boring.
And that's why Pilates exists. That's why hiking exists. If you don't want to be in a hot studio and do stretches, just get your ass on a mountain.
Oh God, do I have to? Please don't make me.
You don't have to. I want to wrap it up, but I want to ask you one last question around here is that, so for everyone who does bullet journal, right? They have followed the method, they have the collection pages, they're doing the things. Is there a point when a bullet journalist can go too far to where they are no longer bullet journaling anymore?
I think that there is, but I'm also not the Bujo police. Like, I'm not standing at the border stamping your little Bujo book saying, yes, this passes, no, this doesn't.
I would be very curious what your stamp would look like because I love stamps. I want to collect that stamp.
Oh gosh, now I'm gonna have to go make a stamp, but it'd probably just be like a big rejected if you just don't pass the bullet journal test. No, denied. But again, I'm not the bullet journal police. I'm not here to tell you that you are or aren't bullet journaling. I do think that it is important in terms of like what we are deeming a bullet journal, especially when you consider the fact that it is a brand. Like the bullet journal brand obviously has one way of interpreting what a bullet journal is or isn't. And when we do start to get a little bit too far from that, say if we're going to like, you know, the decorative journaling space is probably the easiest example because it's probably the one we see the most. Decorative journals can be bullet journals, but not all decorative journals are bullet journals. So when you have things with like hashtag bullet journal on them that aren't actually following any parts of the method at all, then outside people start to get the wrong idea of what a bullet journal actually is. So I don't think it kind of matters in that respect, but I'm not here to tell you what is and isn't a bullet journal. You know, you guys can figure that out for yourselves. Are you bullet journaling based on, I don't know, the conversation we've had today or how you perceive it? But what do you reckon, Mark?
I mean, I think that there is definitely a line. I think people can go too far with what we've already said when they maybe started as a bullet journal. I'll use myself as this example because I feel like I've started and then I peaked with going too far and then I wrangled it back in. And social media is to blame for all of it. But I chose to share my bullet journal on Instagram right when I started my bullet journal because I wanted to do two things with that. One, it was a way to hold myself accountable. have to use the bullet journal to post about the bullet journal. And I also wanted to inspire other people as well who maybe were in the same boat as I was, which was this is too much, to show them that they didn't have to go overboard. And then as I used it over time, as I saw some more stuff online, as I saw what people were reacting to more than others, I absolutely 100% started to become a little bit more performative in my bullet journal. I still use it day to day, so I don't want to get too far, but my collection pages were performative. I was, oh, here's my XYZ tracker. Here's my sleep tracker. Here's my whatever crazy full page collection spread that I made. And I was doing that because I saw other people doing it and did that. And for a while, it was actually stopping me from using my journal. I could not start writing down in my journal if I didn't design a weekly spread and take a picture of it to put on Instagram before I started work. And then it got to the point where I thought, screw it. Like, I have to do work. I can't spend any time right now to make a spread to do this. And so it would just be my week literally was rapid logging. And then I just got to that point where I was like, okay, Mark, you have to do one of two things here. You either have to just give up on this idea of this perfection that you think you have to put out there, this ultra creative new idea all the time thing, or you have to make time for yourself to get yourself prepared for work. Because at the end of the day, the purpose of your bullet journal is to make you better at work. It is better for you to understand what you have to get done, your notes, understand your responsibilities and accomplish those things more than it is about what people like online. And one thing I can say for myself here is that I have never, rarely ever had a single static Instagram post get over maybe 150 likes. I've been on Instagram for a really long time. The things that always do better are Happy Left-Handers Day with a smear across the page. That is like my number one most liked photo I've ever posted, right? Has nothing to do with my bullet journal. And I think for myself that I just accepted that and said, look, like, you're doing this to inspire, you're doing this to share and hold yourself accountable. Who gives a crap if you don't create a really cool spread this week? Actually, that's more real than spending time to design that weekly. So for myself, I've been there, I feel like, and I've done that. So I can say, like, yeah, I started off with the basics. I went way too far to one side because I thought that I had to gain the notoriety and continue to build social media. But what I actually found was that I got more notoriety. I've got more community building when I was just myself. And said, guess what, this week? I totally forgot to make a weekly spread. So here's my pen and here's what my weekly looks like. And it's strictly just rapid logging. And people are like, yeah, that's more real. That's realistic there, Mark. Like, I very much vibe with that.
Yeah, I think that performative bullet journaling, especially in the creator space, is like a very big thing. I think it's probably a bigger thing that we possibly realize, like, for ourselves personally, because I kind of think about, while you were speaking, I was just like, oh my gosh, wait, I do that. The number of times I go to set up for a new cycle or month or like whatever, usually for a new journal, because I'm like, oh, if I provide more ideas, then people will like it more. And it's like, okay, you're trying to think of all of these ideas to put in your journal so that you have something to show people, but are you actually going to use them after the fact? Like, does this provide value, kind of a thing? You have to like check yourself for a second. Like, I can give people 50 different ideas of what to put in their journal for a new journal setup. I should not set up 50 new collections for myself for a new journal setup. That is a surefire way to get bullet journal burnout and not use it, and then be sad Sally sitting there all fed up with my journal, like, oh, I didn't even use any of these. And that's when the purists will come out and be like, oh, you set up all this stuff, you're not even going to use it. I'm like, yeah, okay, thanks for calling me out.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I know we talk about a lot about the bullet journal purist here, and we make little troll noises for them. But let me be clear on that. I think the people that we're talking about are the trolls on YouTube and Instagram who feel so strongly about the method that any deviation from that method therefore makes you not a bullet journaler. And I don't like anything less than someone telling someone what they are or are not doing based off of their choices. Like, we shared today our thoughts on like the things you need to have or ways that you should approach it to really be a bullet journaler. But I would never in my entire life condemn somebody for not having those things, because we all need to make those changes. It's those people who like bring you down, right? I don't know about yourself, Jess, but there has been a few comments over the years that have stuck with me. People are like, oh, it's whatever. I think every creator has one or two that do that, but it really affects you. It makes you think, am I not doing something? Am I a poser, for lack of a better word? Like, am I fake? And I'm not actually doing this? Like, I know that I am. It's like gaslighting yourself, right? You're like, wait, but I am bullet journaling. I know that I am, but this one person has gotten on me so much that I feel as if I'm not. Like, those are the type of people that we don't need in this community. We need people to help lift you up and pump you up and get you excited and reignite your interest in what you're doing. But as a purist, I respect people who just follow the method for what it is, because they have no interest, they don't have no want, they have no desire to add anything else to it. And that is absolutely okay. So I just want to say that before, probably maybe should have started with that instead of ending with that. But just, if you are that purist in there, just know that like I respect your ability to do that, and great. And I do, I very much support that for you. But I think it's when you try to come out and like really just get down on somebody and make them feel worse about themselves. And if you don't realize that you're doing that, and you might be that type of person who enjoys going around the internet and telling people that they're wrong, just know that it does affect people. And regardless of the size of your platform, it can have a negative effect on people. And that's definitely not something that we should be doing.
Yeah, I think it's like the difference between maybe a bullet journal purist versus a bullet journal gatekeeper. So I think of it like kind of a Venn diagram. So you've got the purists, the people who like the method, they follow the method, they do everything by the book. And then within that space, we have a little tiny subsection of the bullet journal gatekeepers, the ones who feel it is their right and mission to tell people, no, you're doing it wrong, you have to do it this way, or it isn't a bullet journal anymore. The biggest part that I think attracts so many people to bullet journaling is that it is flexible. Like Ryder has said, you keep the parts that serve you. Yes, please do start with the original method, do it for several months. We're going to ignore the fact that I didn't, but just start with the original, do it for a few months, and then kind of tweak and change. And it's that modular, flexible system that allows for that. But then if he's saying that we can be flexible with it, but then people are flexible with it, and the gatekeepers come out and say, oh, well, it's not a bullet journal anymore, that's a little bit of a discrepancy.
It absolutely is. I'm now realizing that this episode is probably our longest yet, but I think there's just a lot of passion. I know that I've come across probably very passionate this time around, but I think it's just because, and usually I'm the joker, right? Like I don't get serious about stuff, but this is just one of those things that's out there. And we've talked a lot about bullet journaling. The Planner Pals podcast is not just for bullet journaling, right? It just happens to be something that we both do very well. I'm very excited for our next episode, but before we get to that, Jess, what's the question that we want to ask the community this week?
We've talked a lot today about the different ways that maybe potentially we could be bullet journaling wrong. And I know that both Mark and myself have fallen victim to a couple of them at varying points throughout our journey. So we would love to hear from you. Were there any of those that you have fallen victim to? Maybe have you made your journal performative? Have you had instances where you haven't taken action? Have you been a little bit perfectionistic in terms of your bullet journal pursuits? Let us know either in the comments, or you can email us at plannerpalspodcast@gmail.com.
I'm so excited for this next episode. You have no idea, because next episode, I will be talking Jess into using fountain pens.
We'll see if that actually happens.
So one of the things that Jess and I never realized that you have never used a fountain pen before.
Yeah, no, I've never really felt a need. Like, I understand that they're pretty, but I've just never been like, oh yeah, I should buy that and use it. Like, my clicky pen works fine, right?
It does, but fountain pens, they are just... So we're going to talk about that next episode. I mean, obviously I have a lot of experiences. You're telling me you have none, but we're going to see if we can talk you into trying it. And I haven't, before we do, I know by the time our next episode comes out, the next Archer and Olive subscription box will have been out. Are you a subscriber for that?
I'm not, because they don't actually ship it to New Zealand. So if you're in any part of the world, they don't actually ship to you. I feel you. I get it.
Oh, I didn't know that. I was going to say, because there is a fountain pen inside of this one, which I think is going to open up a lot more people to this experience. So maybe they can join us along as we go through. But what I really want to talk about, really more than just my love for them and how I came across them, is for people who are using analog systems and you're writing, this idea and the enjoyment that I personally feel like fountain pens give you, make you kind of fall in love with writing. and doing it more.
I'm interested to see if Mark can actually convince me to try fountain pens, and if there's anything you think we should include in our discussion, then make sure to drop it in the comments or email us at plannerpowerspodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear your responses to this episode's question. Are there any ways that you think you have been bullet journaling wrong? Or are there any of the points that we talked about that you've kind of fallen victim to? While in this episode we discussed at length some of the ways that you might be bullet journaling wrong, in our previous episode we talked about why we decided to go with bullet journaling in the first place. That one's worth checking out, so give that one a listen, and we'll be back with you soon for our next episode.